our episodes, we've a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. As you know, in this series, we're introducing and exploring our newest member resource called Eco Emotions. In this episode, we're going to look at the area of research around emotional development and sustainability, and I'm delighted for this to be joined by Muireann Ranta. Muireann has recently submitted her PhD for examination with Social Core at the Southeast Technological University, and she lectures on the BA and Master's Early Childhood programs there. She has over 20 years of practice in early years education and care, and her areas of interest focus on nature as a learning environment and children's rights. As part of her research, she has worked with young children and ECEC practitioners to explore their own perspectives and views of nature learning under this education right. Her work provides empirical knowledge for the further development of education for sustainable development, ESD, for the ECEC sector under young children's own definitions of their education and participatory rights. Muireann, you're really welcome, and thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks, Moira. I'm delighted to finally be here.
Yes, we've had a couple of chats about it, so you're finally here. So, in that bio, talked about the nature learning and coming from the children's rights perspective. So maybe can we start there? Can you take us through how sustainability, emotional development, how and why we need to start from that place of children's rights and their own empowerment?
Yes, so I mean, probably to begin with, what would be important to say is that in terms of, education for sustainable development or climate action, under the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which, Ireland ratified over 30 years ago, there is an education right there. It's known as Article 29(1)(e), and what it does is it directs state parties, so in our case, the Irish government, to provide every child that lives in Ireland with an education that supports them to develop a respect for the natural environment. So, this while climate action and education for sustainable development is, quite topical right now, it is an education right that has been, there for our children for a long length of time. So with that in mind, and when we think about, for example, climate anxiety and what repercussions different reports have on climate change taking place, it's important to recognize that the climate crisis itself is a child rights crisis. However, it's also what we describe as an intergenerational injustice, because the climate crisis it's been caused by adults. And therefore, perhaps, placing our children as responsible or as sustainability saviors, that's not that in itself is unethical. So rather, while, the likes of the Sustainable Development Goals, which was established in terms of, providing, countries with guidelines and action plans to support kind of more eco and green sustainable living for countries, while that pinpoints education, really as being the essential tool to support, change in our actions for climate change. It's also important that we involve the children themselves in how that education might look, because it isn't really the case of us saying to our children now, okay, we have to stop using glitter, or we have to stop going to McDonald's, and we have to stop doing all these things that have been important to you and in your culture, because we are now, all having to engage in sustainability. And rather, from a child rights perspective, it's important for us to actually work with the children to establish, what their views are, because as you well know, Moira, children have plenty of views on all sorts of things, and rather to work with the children to develop an education or a learning path with them, um, respectfully to engage in pro-environment behaviours, rather than enforcing something on them. So, so in a nutshell, where I'm coming from with my research is, rather than, recognizing that the climate crisis causes all sorts of negative emotions for people, and rightly so when we see how it's reported, that the approach that I talk about is rather from a strengths-based or an empowerment approach, whereby you start with the child themselves, their views, their perspectives, their knowledge of their own world, and you work with that knowledge to develop in a very organic and holistic manner, sustainable learning that has meaning and that is authentic to them.
And this can start with quite young children, can't it? I mean, you're not talking school age children here. You're talking about quite young children who are 2 and 3, who, we know have the ability through even observing their nonverbal cues, even, small babies, how they can express their likes and dislikes. So, the foundations of this work can start quite early, can't it?
The foundations of this work can start with our babies. When we're talking about, children's rights, we're talking about, from birth. So in terms of, okay, well, how do I engage with sustainability with a 3-month-old baby? Well, we go out for a walk, and we are connecting with the leaves, or we're connecting with the birds, or we are connecting with the elements, so it isn't a case of it is rather a case of, particularly when we're looking at an education approach which is under Article 29 money, which is about developing a respect for the natural environment. We know full well in early childhood how much our babies and our toddlers and our young children love to be outdoors. And it's in that space where we can very organically intersect with developing a sense of wonderment, a sense of eco connection, a sense of appreciation. And then as we move on from developing this wonderment, that we can then, at that moment, really, we're kind of learning in the nature, we're learning about the nature. And as we do that, we're setting the foundations to move on to learning for the nature. So, when we're looking at the birds, and we're looking at the birds in the wintertime, for example, they have difficulties trying to find food. So what can we do? Well, we can feed our birds. And in that kind of example, we are also exploring with our young children about the fact that the birds and us and children and humans are part of nature. So, we're not separate. So even at that really young age, there's a huge amount of opportunity to develop, the understanding of cohabitation and living in harmony with one another. So absolutely, education for sustainable development, while at first point can kind of sound daunting and complex, there's an awful lot of this stuff that we are already doing in early childhood practice that we can say, there you are there now. You're already laying down the steps and the really important and essential aspects of a child rights-based approach to sustainability. You're giving your child, the children that you work with, access to nature and you're opening up the opportunities for them to connect with nature. And then you're working with those nature connections to develop how we all can change our behaviors to work for nature.
I think that bit of awe and wonderment is so important. I think, somebody, I can't think who now, and you might know, said, we can't appreciate what we don't value. And that if we give very young children that sense of value and the importance of nature and how, like you say, we're co-inhabitants, they won't value it as they get older.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about going out in nature, maybe linking it as children get older to the glitter or the McDonald's or whatever. There's something to be said there too, isn't there, about contextualizing it? So if they're linking it to what's in children's own environment, so that you're not talking about abstract concepts, and it's whatever is in their locality and the birds that they see locally, that you're not showing them pictures of eagles that they mightn't see in their environment. You're talking about the robins and the sparrows, and seeing what people are doing already. And that helps give confidence to develop and go further, I think, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's understanding. So first of all, I kind of mentioned, children's own connections with nature. And second of all, understanding a child's local context in order to make, that education for sustainable learning authentic to them is also very much, essential in developing a child rights-based approach to education for sustainable development. And to kind of put, even just in terms of if we're sticking with nature, for example, supporting children to engage with local birds, that also gives them, it very much develops their own sense of place and their own sense of locality and their sense of belonging and identity. There's so many layers upon layers of just bringing our little Baba outside, to look at the blackbirds. There's so much in that from a sustainability perspective. And we have been doing it for so many years in early childhood. There is such a synergy between, early childhood pedagogy and pedagogy for sustainability.
A
And
lot
I
of it is
think,
instinctive, isn't it? I mean, you've your baby in your arms, you see a bird and you say, oh, look what's over there, look what's on the branch.
yes,
Oh,
I
what
mean,
color are the leaves now?
absolutely. I mean, we do a lot of it is instinctive. I think possibly now, for example, where, to kind of further support the actual sustainability part is where we are educating and empowering our educators and the adults in the children's lives and recognizing that at this very young age, there is an interdependent role between the two. So while children very naturally engage with their own ideas, and while educators, build on those ideas, actually giving the educators now the science behind sustainability, more resources on the learning for sustainability and what it means, what is the impact of let's say, for example, even in my own research, I noticed that with my little ones, when we were outside with horse chestnuts and pine cones, like they wanted to bring them all home, right? So my little ones, they wanted to bring them home. So we're learning in the nature, we're learning about nature. These are pine cones, and they're engaged, they're using them in sociodrama. But then when we're leaving, they wanted to bring them all home. So I was then able to intercept and say gently, well, if you bring all of them home, then there's going to be no food left, for our friends, the squirrels, or there's the little insects want to live in the pine cones. And so then just being able to kind of intersect gently with this kind of extra bit of knowledge and being able to explain to children, well, if you take them home, there'll be nothing left. So therefore, we need to modify that behavior. Now, let's be realistic. It's not always very easy to explain to a couple of children that they can't take stuff home. maybe it's more a case of negotiating. Okay, let's take one home and let's leave them all. But that's also very authentic, and it's because it's also respectful to the children as well, and for them to kind of, for us to respect their wishes and their exploration of nature, plus the fact, that there is a need to live harmoniously. So I think, while I mentioned there is such a fabulous synergy of between the pedagogies of early childhood education and sustainability. And I would say that we really are at a pedagogical advantage when, so for example, sustainability is not necessary, it's not a new thing for us. We long understand the role of nature with our children. But now I think the next kind of steps to support sustainability, or to support the learning for, is to firstly empower our educators and say, you have this, your skill set is there, you know the importance of understanding your little learners. You understand how they engage in learning, and then equipping them with the science, the learning for bit, so that they can then gently intersect that part, is really kind of where we are now in terms of supporting sustainability for in early childhood.
And you've given us some lovely examples there, I think, of how children can learn in and from nature to, and that supports their appreciation and I suppose of ecosystems, and that, a pine cone isn't just a pine cone, it can be a habitat. And that can really help to protect nature and build sustainable practices. Have you any other examples of that? Does technology play a role in, just when you were talking there about maybe bringing the one back and leaving them where they are? What came into my head was, back in the day, you'd be looking for frog spawn in the spring to bring into the setting so children can see frogs developing. But, we now know that that wasn't sustainable, and that it in fact could have inhibited the life cycle of frogs. But maybe, are there things like webcams and closed circuit TVs and that type of thing that you can still give children those experiences without having to have, for example, the frog spawn in the in the environment?
Absolutely. And you know what? I think that you've brought up a good point, because I guess it's important for me to say that, the reason why I kind of went about this research is because of my own sense of wonderment of how I was brought up, kind of with my father, taking the opportunity to kind of firstly just be in nature. And so I know that only even a couple of years ago, when anybody even introduced the notion of technology or digital engagement with technology to as an also as a means to explore nature, I was no, absolutely no way. I'm a mother too of teenagers, but this is a really important point that you're making, Moira, because again, it's down to respecting cultures, right? And so children and, my teenagers, you know, technology is very much part of their culture, right? And it is a very effective, means of learning. And even myself, just in, I love the webcams that are up in Dublin Zoo. And only yesterday there was something on Twitter where there was like a little cam in a blue tit nest, right? And then showing exactly, the complex nature it takes for a little blue tit to build the nest, and the endurance. So, yes, and equally, kind of relative to my own research, we had with the children, we used magnifying, right, big, huge magnifying glasses.
They're
And
wonderful.
oh, wonderful.
I just love to see children with magnifying glasses, and
And
fantastic.
but interesting, right? Interesting from a child based perspective, right? So when we were getting, we had these magnifying glasses and they were massive, and we were going on an insect hunt. And by using this piece of technology, the children were learning rather than kind of touching the insects or the children rather learned kind of the concept of giving the insect space. So, using the magnifying glass to examine and to learn and to understand the insect, but equally teaching them. But don't get me wrong, it wasn't all beautiful and romantic. I mean, when we did see a centipede first, there was a push and a shove for people to touch the centipede. But again, this is where I was able to intersect with the four bits. So we were in nature and we were learning about nature and through nature. But with the magnifying glass, I was able to kind of modify the children's behavior and go, well, if we're going to touch this insect, it's going to be scared, we might hurt it, so we need to modify, what we're going to do here. So in a nutshell, absolutely. While at first breath, I had a very narrow mind when it came to, did technology versus nature, I now very much understand that, given the fact that, children don't necessarily have first-hand access to nature, but also make it clear that I want to say that under Article 29(1)(e) of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, children should have access to nature. So if they are, for example, in an urban area, we need to look at how we can get them into our local biodiversity, but also at the same hand, acknowledging that technology does most certainly support, learning about nature, and also gives us an opportunity to kind of understand, nature rhythms in a way that we might not. So it opens a whole world of watching how that blue tit builds that nest.
Yeah, it isn't about one replacing the other. It's
No,
about, using it to, support and give children experiences, but, keeping it as local and relevant. And, when you're saying about, you know, giving children experiences in nature, again, the other thought that came to mind was, there was a time when outdoor areas were safety surfacing and high walls. And I think it's lovely to see settings introducing, even things like raised beds or tree trunks that they can sit on, because that does start to introduce, if you turn over the tree trunks, you'll see the little insects that have made it their home, and encouraging that, and seeing nature, seeing things growing inside and outside.
raised beds, I honestly think that they're like the number one resource when it comes, and a raised bed or even a few pots, if you do happen to be very, very limited in your space, I think that the interaction with the soil, the interaction with the little insects and the worms and seeds, that in and of itself, are a very natural opportunities to think about sustainability for sure.
I suppose bringing the emotion side of it, I think it's widely recognized, and I don't know, if you've research to speak to about, but how much better we feel when we're in nature. Even, I was talking to somebody already today, and there was, things in their head, and they were saying, I think I just need to, go out for a run, and, some of it will start to ease away. And we feel like that. I think it's no different for children, that being, none of us like to see maybe the wet day, but that experience of climate, of weather, and being in nature has a huge impact on our emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, really kind of my experience of that is kind of more anecdotal, but I can say, without a shadow of a doubt that, um, regular access to nature, certainly in terms of regulating my own emotions, has played a huge role. But what I did want to say in that regard is I've actually very recently been over to Acera in Brighton, where I know a number of your Early Childhood Ireland colleagues were there flying the flag as well. We had a fantastic, I think we had 29 Irish delegations over this year. Really, really strong research coming out of Ireland with regards to sustainability. That the kind of role or the interplay between nature and well-being and the role that it plays between the two was something that was really apparent in a lot of the research coming forward. And equally, in terms of kind of supporting educators, and I in my research, I worked firstly with a group of children to hear their perspectives, and then I went and I worked with a group of early childhood educators to hear their perspectives from the children. And something that came back from from the participants that I worked with was the need for us to develop educators' sense of wonderment, and to also, to develop educators' sense of well-being, and how, particularly, and this is important to say, I mean, we are all very much aware that we are working in a very stressed and at times feel, very kind of undervalued in our education sector. And that, if we now come on to the educators and go, right, now we're in a climate crisis, so we need to do this, this, and this. Well, in actual fact, and it does come with the same kind of principle as working with children, we need to kind of firstly acknowledge how valuable our educators are. We need to acknowledge, supporting their well-being, to empower them to kind of have the opportunity to develop their own sense of wonderment, so that they can then in turn transfer that sense of wonderment and enjoyment and sense of well-being in nature with our children. So there is most definitely, in terms of emotions and sustainability, it's very much intertwined. And it's very much a case of, really working and respecting, the well-being of our children and our educators for that sense of sustainability or sustainability learning to be effective.
Totally. I mean, I think, it's widely acknowledged, but sometimes maybe we don't acknowledge it to ourselves or appreciate it about ourselves, that how can we support the well-being of children if our own well-being isn't isn't good and isn't being supported. It's vital. It's absolutely vital. And that educators see this as something that supports them in their work, not, like you say, another thing that they have to fit into an already crowded day.
Yeah, and I think, Moira, if there was one thing that I would love to come from this podcast is, I have researched this area now since 2018, and I cannot stress enough the role of our educators' skill set already. We have really our skill. There is so much for other sectors, educational sectors, to learn from early childhood pedagogy when it comes to developing authentic and meaningful and rights-based approaches to sustainability with young children or with any learner. We are champions in terms of our pedagogy and how we engage with our relational pedagogy when we and we're all talk now about our slow pedagogy, and there is an intertwinement with our pedagogy in terms of really moving from, okay, we now need to change everything because we're in a climate crisis, to actually coming in and meeting your learner wherever they are at and collaborating, from a strengths-based approach and working in small steps towards climate action that is respectful and meaningful to the child, to the educator, to the local setting.
And to families. And and just as I mentioned that, parents, working with parents, harnessing the expertise of parents is, is always a very inclusive way to go. You mentioned to Sarah the European Early Childhood Education Research Association, and I know you're involved in the special interest group and transnational group there, but you're also involved in OMEP, which has done some work already on sustainability. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the sustainability from the start module that I know you were very involved in, Muireann?
Oh yes, thanks, Moira. I had forgotten about that. Yeah, so actually, OMEP, in general, has really been championing education for sustainability all the way back in 2008, and have developed any number of different, resources to support, early childhood settings in that regard. But most notably, we have OMEP, we worked as part of an Erasmus project, and an online company known as Ed Child, and then five OMEP partners. So we had OMEP Ireland, as we mentioned, OMEP Sweden, OMEP France, OMEP Croatia, and OMEP Czech. I nearly forgot Czech. And it was a big, 2-year project where we have developed a free online resource for educators. Although I would argue, not just educators for early childhood, but it's a resource that it's very accessible online, and it goes through it has 8 modules. So it very much kind of, it's not, while, for example, it sounds like I was very much, up until this point, been talking about nature, it takes on board the fact that education for sustainable development is complex, and that there's different pillars. There's an economic pillar, and there is a social and cultural pillar, and there is a political pillar, and there's an ecological pillar. So this resource breaks that down, and it's something that you can access the educator can access at any time. There's a lot of information that can be read about the different areas. Then there is a number of suggested activities that the educator themselves can, work with the children in their settings. It's set up in a way that the module itself can be presented to the children themselves, and you can introduce it as, this is our sustainability journey, and they've got 8 little friends that are all involved in the different modules, and there's like a big poster that you can download, and as the children kind of engage in different activities, they can kind of document in whatever way they want, the different parts of. So yes, it's I and just one last thing I wanted to say about that. We actually had an opportunity for our own educators from Ireland to come over and to give their feedback on the module and whether or not it could work in the national context. And we learned from our Irish participants that they felt that there was also a need for the educators to have some kind of a space to reflect together. So with perhaps people who had more experiences in sustainability. So to that end, OMEP Ireland have developed a community of practice that runs alongside the module, so that for anyone who's engaging in the module, they can then they can join into our community of practice, which is going to be run every 6 weeks. And it's an opportunity for educators to engage with those of us who are involved in the module, to exchange ideas, to exchange what works and what doesn't work, and really to kind of develop sustainability at a ground level, at a practice level, and at a way that is respectful to each individual setting.
That's
I hope
wonderful.
I've explained that well.
No, I think you have. I think you have. It sounds absolutely wonderful. And we can put the link to it in the show notes. Muireann, thank you so much. It's been so interesting and great to hear, and I suppose reassuring to hear how simple it is to start. And who knows where the journey will take you after that.
Absolutely. And I think, really relevant to your eco emotions is, recognizing that at first glance, things can be overwhelming. But I rest assured that within early childhood, we are champions when it comes to developing sustainability learning in a way that is gentle, authentic, respectful, and all of these little things that we're doing, big things come. Big actions come from small steps. So, yeah.
I love that link you made at the end about how it links to slow pedagogy. I think, there's so many synergies there. So, Muireann, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
You're very welcome. It was my absolute pleasure.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and spread the word to your friends and colleagues.